guys and gals, it's Andrew. Thank you for the fact that I now have 1,000 subscribers or nearly on my channel, depending on when this video goes up. And for that, welcome to my brand new series inspired by the names of the YouTubers typed in the intro. I present to you the first episode of my brand new series, Engines of the Pere Marquette, where I talk about steam locomotives purchased by the Pere Marquette Railroad. Unlike the other versions of this topic, such as the ones by Amtrak Guy 365 and Thunderbolt 1000 Siren Productions, for example, I've decided to make my entry into this trend with a railroad that only existed back in the steam age and talk mostly about steam locomotives, for the exception of one or two episodes that'll go to diesels. I was originally going to do my own series for the Union Pacific Railroad since I am a Big Boy fan, but an Engines of Union Pacific series already exists. Said series from OttoMatic. Yes, it's spelled that way. You know, the German kind of name. So I decided to go with a different railroad for my own series. I chose the Pere Marquette Railroad since I am a 1225 fan, and that she's my favorite steam locomotive, albeit tied with the Union Pacific Big Boys because I love both so much I can't put one ahead of another. And on a final note, I will try my best not to copy Amtrak Guy 365, Bolt, and others with their respective series of this kind. I'll try in one way by not working from oldest to newest through the sequence, but instead number the episodes based by the class's numbering sequences in numerical order instead. Though, one class will cut ahead in the lineup because I want to do that particular class for a future holiday special. I'll leave you to guess what that class will be, and for what kind of holiday special it'll be. But, spoiler alert, I will make and post that episode later this year, assuming I don't miss the window. For the holiday, of course. And there's my phone ringing. But enough chit-chatting, let's kick off the first episode of my new series, starting with the first steam locomotives in the Pere Marquette's numbering sequence, the 10-wheelers. But first, how about a bit of an introduction to the Pere Marquette for anyone who's new to it or has never even heard of it? The name does sound strange. This is because the railroad was named after Pere Jacques Marquette S.J., a French missionary who founded Michigan's first European settlement, Sault-Ste-Marie. I hope I pronounced that correct. I know, I don't know a lot of French words, dang it me! Incorporated into existence on November 1st, 1899, the Pere Marquette Railroad began operations on the first day of the 20th century when it was officially formed by the merger of three Michigan-based railroads. The railroads in question were the Flint and Pere Marquette Railroad, Detroit, Grand Rapids and Western Railroad, and the Chicago and West Michigan Railway. By the time the Pere Marquette, or PM for short, became part of the Chesapeake in Ohio in 1947, they had turned out quite the motive power for a railroad located mostly in the state of Michigan. The first engines in the railroad's numbering scheme, or in other English, the locomotives with the lowest road numbers, were 159 440s. Well, the last 11 of them were numbered 800 to 811 for some reason, while the remaining 148 were numbered 1 through 148. But since all of them were inherited from the three railroads the PM was made up, and the PM never purchased any of their own 440s, I will likely cover them in a future bonus episode. The next locomotives in the PM's numbering scheme were 50 460 10-wheelers, with 22 being inherited from the Pere Marquette's constituent companies, and the remaining 28 being designed and purchased by the Pere Marquette. The Pere Marquette had them numbered 150 through 159, almost carrying off where the American types, or 440s, left off. I say almost because the PM skipped number 149 for this sequence, so they never had a number 149 on their roster. A similar thing happened with the Southern Pacific in 1943 when they were supposed to get 16 GS6s, numbers 4460 through 4475 from Lima, but the proposed engines 4470 through 4475 got diverted to the Western Pacific by the War Production Board, and never worked on the SP in the end. And SP for some reason skipped the 4470 through 4475 sequence when they placed their next order of GS Northerns and onwards, so SP never had any 6 steamers with that numbering sequence. Anyway, back to the Pere Marquette and its 10-wheelers. Their entire 460 class was divided into 14 subclasses. But things start to get a bit strange already, as all of the subclasses of the inherited roster carried the same designation as one another, despite being built in a different year by a different builder. And to add on for it, instead of giving the inherited engines the lower numbers and picking up with the purchased engines, the Pere Marquette gave their 460s a confusing and messy numbering scheme. In fact, this scheme is more confusing than the LNER A3 numbering scheme, so even LNER numbering can't get as confusing as what a lot of episodes in my series may or even will have. Unlike when I talked about the PM's Mikados in my top 10 extinct US steam locomotives, I only showed a picture of the roster, which did shave off time from that video at least. But in this series, I am willing to give information of those numbering schemes via both images and talking, in case there's anyone in the audiences who's deaf or blind. Oh dear, let's go. I am gonna have so many bloopers on this that I'm gonna need to remember to count them so that you understand how not easy it was to record this part. Starting from 150 in numerical order, the first 10 wheelers in the sequence were 10 Class Ts built in 1902 by Brooks for the Pere Marquette and numbered 150 through 159. Then the next 22 in the sequence, numbers 160 through 188, were given to the inherited 10 wheelers. Oh boy, PM. The first up were two Class T1s built in 1899 by Manchester for the DGR&W as 45 and 46, then renumbered to 160 and 161 respectively by the Pere Marquette after it was formed. Up next were two Class T3s built in November 1898 by Dixon for the DGR&W as numbers 41 and 42, then renumbered to 162 and 163 by the Pere Marquette. Then came a single Class T4 built in April 1898 by Schenectady for the C&WN as number 104, then renumbered to 164 by, you know what, the PM. Then after that came two more T1s from the same shop for the same railroad in 1899, numbered 125 and 126, then renumbered to 165 and 166. Following that came 7 more T3s, built in 1896 by Brooks as FNPM 94 through 100, then renumbered as Pere Marquette 167 through 173. Then after that came another T4 built in 1878 by Baldwin as FNPM 46, then became Pere Marquette 174. Then after that, another T3 built by Pittsburgh in 1898 as FNPM 47, then became PM 175. And finally, 6 T2s, built by Rhode Island in April 1892 as CNWN 172 through 177, and became PM 176 through 181. What a flipping mouthful that was. Seriously, PM? Is it that hard to rank them by age in numerical order? And before I forget, the mentioned classifications for the inherited engines were the ones the PM gave them. Or in other English, the mentioned classifications were what they were reclassified as by the Pere Marquette after they became Pere Marquette locomotives. Oh boy. Now on to the remaining purchased by PM engines, whose classification is also a bit slapdash. The next engine in the number sequence was a single T5 numbered 182 and built by Manchester in 1902. But instead of being bought first-hand, this was a second-hand locomotive as it was originally Orange and Northwestern Railroad number 106 before being bought by the PM prior to 1905. It was the only PM 460 to be bought second-hand. The next 15 PM purchased engines were built in 1903, with engines 183 through 186 coming from Brooks in April and labeled as Class T, 187 through 199 of the Class TC coming from Pittsburgh in July, 192 through 197 of the Class TA coming from Brooks in October, and finally, to sum up the purchased roster, the last two engines, numbers 198 and 199 of the Class TB coming from Brooks in 1902. Not as messy as the inherited engine's numbering scheme, both by year and class, but still a bit out of order regarding year and classification letters/numbers after the T. The 10-wheelers that were purchased by the Pere Marquette were obviously newer than the inherited ones. They were also bigger and naturally superior engines to the inherited ones, so I don't need to compare the specifications of the inherited and purchased 460s, not to mention the series is mainly about engines purchased by the Pere Marquette, and not so much about those inherited by it. Just like I did for the numbering, I'll also talk about the specifications of these locomotives and put them in text to be generous for anyone who's blind, deaf, or listening to this like a podcast. Though I'm only going to do it for the purchased 10-wheelers this time, because it's about engines purchased by the PM. Plus, I couldn't really find the specifications of the inherited ones. The total weight of the 10-wheelers ranged from a lowest of 77.15 tons for the Class TBs to a greatest of 141.18 tons of the Class TAs. The T5 and the 2 TBs had tenders with a fuel capacity of 8 tons of coal and 3,000 gallons of water, while the rest of the 10-wheelers subclasses had larger tenders with a capacity of 14 tons of coal and 45,000 gallons of water. The firebox's grade areas range from a smallest of 23.4 square feet on the T5 and TBs to a largest of 32.5 square feet on the TCs. The T5s and TBs also had the smallest driving wheels out of the purchased 10-wheelers at 56 inches in diameter, and the TCs had the largest at 63 inches in diameter. And as you've probably guessed it by now, the TBs and T5 also had the shortest overall wheelbase at 44 feet, but this time the TAs were the largest when it came to wheelbase, which for them was 54 feet, 4.5 inches. The distinction of the shortest overall length went to, you guessed it, the T5 and TBs.
Of course!
At 51 feet and 8.5 inches, and the TAs had the longest overall length, at 63 feet, 2 inches. The bore by stroke of the cylinders was 17.5 by 24 inches on, you know what, the 182 and the TBs. For the Class Ts, it was 18 by 24 inches, and the rest of the subclasses bore by strokes were 20 by 26 inches. Second to last time I'll treat the T5 and TBs like runts, I promise. They had 160 psi boilers, and the other subclasses had a boiler pressure of 200 psi. All 28 locomotives used Stevenson valve gear, but the Class Ts and TAs used piston valves, while the rest had slide valves. Tractive efforts ranged from a weakest of 16,600 pounds for the T5 to a strongest of 29,395 pounds for the TAs, though the TCs came close at 29,300 pounds. The TBs and Class Ts had a tractive effort of 17,080 pounds and 21,000 pounds respectively. The 10-wheelers were rated for 5,726 tons on level track, though this was exceeded by the pair of TBs, which were rated for 6,513 tons. The Pere Marquette used their inherited 460s mostly for branch line freight trains, while the newer purchased ones were used mostly for passenger trains. Some were even used on 8-car resort specials on occasion, which must have been a max for them at higher speeds. I mean, they're 460s after all. It's also worth mentioning that some of the purchased engines had centered headlights, while the others, including all of the inherited 460s, had high-mounted ones. All 28 of the purchased 460s were eventually fitted with brick arches in their fireboxes to aid in combusting fuel and improving efficiency. By the time the Pere Marquette was formed at the beginning of the year 1900, 10-wheelers had become obsolete on most US railroads, while the PM was among few still using this type. But just like most railroads, the Pere Marquette eventually enlarged the 460 and 442 wheel arrangements into larger 462 Pacifics, which they began purchasing starting in 1910. The Pacifics began to replace the aging 10-wheelers on passenger trains, and to add on to their aid in displacing the 10-wheelers, the Pacifics were also accompanied by 280 consolidations, which had been flooding into the PM's freight fleet since 1901, and soon, the 10-wheelers couldn't find any work to do. The T5 was the first 460 to go, being cut up for scrap at Saginaw in 1922. The last of the inherited engines were all gone by 1928, with none surviving. Scrapping commenced on the rest of the 10-wheeler fleet in 1928, and the Great Depression finished them off, along with several other railroads' aging locomotives. numbers 153 and 192 were the last to go in April 1934. None survived. Aesthetically, there were a few engines that could match the grace of a high-delivered 460 at the head of a wooden varnish. The PM's 10-wheelers certainly fit the mold of classic turn-of-the-century power. Striped spoked wheels, straight boiler, high shotgun stack, canted cylinders, and an old-style pilot. Hey guys, Andrew here. Before I close out, I would like to mention that while you possibly may not find this information on the internet, which I discovered for myself, I was able to find pretty much as much information as necessary through this book called Pere Marquette Power by Thomas W. Dixon Jr. and Art Millen. I happened to get this book for Christmas back in 2018, so I've had this one for nearly 3 years. And if I scroll in ahead, and I'll get to that later, but in this, it pretty much has these specifications and a whole bunch of photographs of pretty much every locomotive inherited, purchased, and used by the Pere Marquette Railroad. From small 440s to, of course, the famous 284 Berkshires, and let me check the table of contents. Hopefully you can see it. And even some miscellaneous stuff and some diesels as well. And the book actually does go in numerical order for the numbering sequences, which is one thing I'm actually deciding to do from this series to make it differ from the series done by Amtrak Guy 365 and Thunderbolt 1000 Siren Productions, both of which do Engines of Amtrak and Engines of SEPTA respectively. And just a bit of a preview, you can actually find this on Amazon too, and hopefully maybe at some other bookstores or whatever you can get a book from. Oh yeah. A bit of a disclaimer though, and there is just one downside I have with this book, is pretty much when it was made. As you can see, it's August 1st, 1983. So if you know 1225's history very well, you'll know that this was, of course, before 1225 was restored to operation in 1988, but of course not before Chris Van Allsburg published the classic Christmas book, The Polar Express, which 1225 served as the inspiration for. And way before 1225 would become most well known for being the basis of the Polar Express when Warner Brothers released the film adaptation of the Polar Express, so yeah, it's a bit of a shame. But that's really the only point I have to knock off whatsoever. I mean, other than that, you can find some photos of Pere Marquette engines you possibly may not be able to find on the internet. Unless you decide to take pictures of them and post them yourself. Post them to social media yourselves, which I had to do in order to get the photos for this. Because I couldn't find any photos of PM 460s on the internet. And of course Google, as you could probably already imagine. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the first episode of my brand new series, Engines of Pere Marquette. I'm actually reading it off the script on my monitor. If you want me to do more episodes of this series, drop a like and subscribe to my channel to see more steam locomotive related content. Also make sure you activate notifications so that way you won't miss any future uploads. Of course, assuming you are subscribed, because that's how you get the feature in the first place. And also stay tuned for the upcoming Mystery Holiday special of this series, which I mentioned back in the intro. Again, I'm not going to mention which class it'll be for and which holiday it'll be, only I know that, but I'm still going to leave it to you to figure out what that will be. And also feel free to leave your guesses in the comment section below for both parts. Oh, and on a final note, depending on when this video is published, I'm actually going to be out again, finally, for it's actually been a long time since I've actually pretty much left on a trip. I mean, last time I ever made an announcement was back in 2019, the fall of 2019. And I will be traveling across the United States for 3 weeks, but don't worry, I will definitely be going to some train museums, and especially a few that do have at least one Union Pacific big boy in them, so for this summer, I should see up to 3 new Union Pacific big boys, and I might possibly stop in St. Louis, Missouri, because while I may have been to this Museum of Transportation in St. Louis before, which happened back in 2019, that was before Norfolk and Western 2156 came back to the NMT. But now that it's back, I look forward to hopefully seeing if we can actually get to the museum and see 2156 in person. Because that obviously didn't happen last time. And also have a reunion with 4006. I might even see Heavy Challenger 3977 if it's possible. I will definitely make sure to get a train load of footage from each museum and also record some vlogs, which I will post to my second channel, which is in the description below. Also in the description are links to my Facebook page, Instagram page, and my Patreon page, the latter of which I post my LEGO designs on. Well, for Patreons mostly. You know, my actual duck designs. Either ways, guys, thanks for watching my video. Hope you like the idea of this series. Hopefully you want me to do more. I hope to get at least 2 or 3 more episodes of this series out by the time I make the holiday special. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.